our dear listeners, and thank you for joining us on our YouTube channel. Today we are going to discuss about the essentials for scientific research methodology. The purpose of this presentation is to help the students who are preparing to write their final dissertation for the fulfillment of academic requirement, how they can bring this work to its fruition. So if you've liked the video, please do not hesitate to subscribe if you haven't yet subscribed. As we come to say, we are talking about the essentials of scientific research methodology. So for you to carry out the scientific research, the first step is to choose the topic. So the choice of the topic is influenced by different factors. First of all, there is the domain or the field of the researcher. In fact, if a researcher has followed clinical psychology, cannot choose, for example, a topic in economics. So he must choose the topic which is in his domain. Number two, there is the actual situation that needs a serious scrutiny. So for example, like an outbreak of a disease. So this can push the researchers to try to find the solution to that particular problem and carry out scientific research on that particular disease in order to contain the outbreak. Number three, there is the observation and the perception of the researcher. So the researcher, according to his observation and his perception, he can feel the need to carry out a research based on his perception and observation. Number four, there is other researchers' findings and the recommendation. So another researcher can recommend other researchers to deepen his research, and some of them may be interested to deepen his research by carrying out other related research studies on his research. Number five, there is statistical data trends in a given domain. The statistical data trends can also influence the researcher to choose the topic. In fact, here the researcher can find some alarming statistics, and he may feel that need, or he may be motivated to carry out the research based on those alarming statistics that he has found. So for this study, I want to be involving practice. So let me suppose that I'm studying developmental studies, and I wanted to choose just the topic. Let me mention first of all that a good topic must contain the two variables. The two main variables, which are dependent variables and independent variable. Yeah, so let me choose the topic. For example, I can choose the topic, the contribution of private sector to poverty reduction, case study of MTN Rwanda, because everywhere I pass, I see people selling products of MTN. So I think MTN has contributed so much as a private company to reducing poverty. So based on my observation and the perception, even my field, I can choose, yes, that topic, the contribution of private sector to poverty reduction, case study of MTN Rwanda. So when you finish to choose the topic, then you move on to writing research proposal. The research proposal must have three main parts. Number one, there is general introduction. Number two, there is the literature review. And number three, there is research methodology. So let us start talking about general introduction of your research proposal. In a general introduction, we find, first of all, the background of the study. The background of the study is the first subtopic, subtitle for general introduction. Here the researcher presents the existing problem, I mean here dependent variable, globally, regionally, and nationally, and presents the background of the independent variables. The researcher must cite some relevant statistical data, phrases, and the citation from published material. Let us, for example, enter into practice and consider our topic that we've chosen previously, the contribution of private sector to poverty reduction in developing countries, case study MTN Rwanda. In this topic, poverty reduction is the dependent variable. In the background of the study, the researcher must present the situation of poverty globally, regionally, and nationally, using statistics from published reports by highlighting that poverty is really an existing problem. The researcher must go further and presents the background of the independent variable. In our topic, private sector investment is an independent variable. The researcher must present the role of private sector in reducing poverty based on other researchers' findings and the published reports. So the researcher can also go far and show how different strategies were adopted globally, regionally, to tackle poverty. For example, in 2000, during the Millennium Development Goals, all countries agreed to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. That is globally. And regionally, different countries started elaborating what we call and putting in practice what we call EDPLS, Economic Development and Poverty Reduction Strategies. Among those strategies of poverty reduction, private sector investment was among the strategies to reduce. Through this presentation, the researcher can come up with a good presentation of background of his study and finally highlights that different strategies have been adopted and they've solved the problem at a certain extent, but a lot needed to be done. The second subtitle then, after the background of the study, is the statement of the problem. The statement of the problem is the second subtitle for your general introduction. So the statement of the problem includes the presentation of the problem under the study as a case study with empirical evidence in the context of the study. This may be from a policy document, newspaper, journal, and other existing report. When we consider the practice, for example, looking at our topic that we have chosen previously about the contribution of private sector to poverty reduction in developing countries, case study MTN Rwanda. Through statistical data, the researcher must highlight that even though a number of policies and strategies were adopted to tackle poverty, a considerable number of people remains under the line of poverty. So, and the private sector investment remains a reliable solution to poverty reduction, and an investigation into the contribution of private sector to poverty reduction, taken as a case study MTN Rwanda, would be a great deal of insight to policymakers and the private sectors in eradicating poverty. So by presenting this statement of the problem and using also statistics that shows that poverty is an alarming and existing problem, the researcher can come up with a good presentation of the statement of the problem. After presenting the background of the study and the problem statement in your general introduction of your research proposal, then you move on to the third subtitle, which is the objectives of the study. The objectives of the study are the purposes of the study. These include general objective and the specific objectives. For example, in our topic, the contribution of private sector to poverty reduction in developing countries, case study MTN Rwanda. General objective can be to assess the contribution of private sector to poverty reduction in developing countries, taken as a case study MTN Rwanda. So the specific objectives can be broken from this general objective. The first one can be to identify the services offered by MTN Rwanda which contribute to poverty reduction. The second specific objective can be to determine poverty reduction indicators in Rwanda. Then the third one can be to assess the relationship between private sector and MTN Rwanda and poverty reduction in Rwanda. Research questions is also the next subtopic that the researcher must present in his general introduction after general objectives. The research questions must be fully related to the specific objectives of your study. For example, the first research objective was to identify the services offered by MTN Rwanda which contributed to poverty reduction. Therefore, the research question must be the following: what are the services offered by MTN Rwanda which contributes to poverty reduction? Number two, the objective of the study was to identify the indicators of poverty reduction in Rwanda. Therefore, the second specific research question must be also: what are poverty reduction indicators in Rwanda? Number three, the research objective was to highlight the relationship between private sector, taken as a case study MTN Rwanda, and the poverty reduction in Rwanda. Therefore, the research question can be: is there any significant relationship between MTN Rwanda and the poverty reduction in Rwanda? So based on this example, we can see that really these specific objectives are fully related to our research questions that we come to formulate. Then after formulating the research questions, some higher education institutions requires students, researchers, to present research hypothesis or assumption of the study. So you can ask what is research hypothesis or the assumption of the study. These are expectations of the researcher of what can be the response to his formulated research questions. The research hypothesis or assumption of the study highlight the relationship between variables. If we say between variables, we mean independent variables and the dependent variables. So the research hypothesis must highlight the relationship between those two variables, independent variables and the dependent variables. For example, based on our 4 formulated research questions, the first research hypothesis can be the following. MTN Rwanda, through communication services delivery, money transfer, and the purchasing of its product like internet bundle, talk time, and mobile money, has significantly reduced poverty. Number 2, which corresponded to the second research question, which was 4 formulated, it is the following. Employment opportunity, income generation among stakeholders, improving people's living standards, financing developmental projects, and infrastructure development are MTN Rwanda input to poverty reduction. Number 3, hypothesis or assumption can be MTN Rwanda through its investment and services has significantly contributed to reducing poverty. After formulating your assumptions of your study or your research hypothesis, then you present the 5th subtitle, which is the significance of the study. The significance of the study includes the choice of the topic, the motive behind the choice of the topic, what has motivated the researcher to choose the topic. The interest of the study also is included in the significance of the study. In the interest of the study, the researcher presents personal interest, relevance, and the importance to the community. He shows how the study is academically and scientifically important. He shows also how the study is important to all beneficiaries related to the study. After the significance of the study, the 6th subtitle of general introduction is the scope of the study. The aim of the scope of the study is to set boundaries of the research. Setting those boundaries must be domain bound, timely, and geographically set. So the researcher must set boundaries or limit his research in a domain, in a time, and in the area of research. Then after presenting the scope of the study, the researcher presents what we call conceptual framework. Conceptual framework is the 7th subtitle in your general introduction of your research proposal. So what is the conceptual framework? In fact, the conceptual framework is the diagram or the chart summarizing the presentation of both main variables and their sub-variables. It is generally the backbone of the whole study. So, taking our topic that we've previously chosen, the contribution of private sector to poverty reduction in developing countries, case study MTN Rwanda, we can present the conceptual framework as follows. The independent variables on one side and the dependent variables on the other side. In independent variable, we have the main independent variable, which is private sector, or MTN Rwanda as one of private company, and the sub independent variables can be delivery of communication services, money transfer, and the purchasing of products like internet, talk time, and mobile money. Then dependent variable, the main dependent variable can be poverty reduction, and poverty reduction can have some sub-variables like employment opportunities, income generation, improving people's living standards, financial development project, and infrastructure, financing developmental project and infrastructure development. So MTN, through those sub-variables, can influence poverty reduction by offering employment opportunities, income generation, generating income to people, improving people's living standards, financing developmental project, and infrastructure development. So if you can see this chart, this can be an example, an illustrative example of the conceptual framework. So after presenting the conceptual framework, the last subtitle in your general introduction must be the operational definition of key terms. Here, the variables as presented in the conceptual framework have to be explained, insisting on their meaning in the study. Then after presenting general introduction of your research proposal, which include background of the study, problem statement, research objectives, research questions, research hypothesis, scope of the study and the significance of the study, conceptual framework, and the operational definition of key terms, the researcher move forward and present the literature review. The literature review focuses mainly on the theoretical review and the empirical review of the literature and the research gap. Therefore, your literature review must contain the three parts: the theoretical review, the empirical review, and the research gaps. In the theoretical review, the researcher make a theoretical review about independent and the dependent variable. It means it presents any information from newspaper, magazine, reports, and books about the variables of the study. In the empirical review, the researcher presents the findings of related research to his studies. This refers to related research studies that are related to the independent and the dependent variables. So note that for a good literature review must be in line with the objective of the study. It must contain detailed information about all variables and the sub-variables of your study. It must present also other research studies findings which are related to the researcher's study. So the literature review which fulfills the three criteria is really a good literature review, to be in line with the research objectives, to contain detailed information about all variables and the sub-variables of researchers' study, to present other research studies findings which are related to the research under study. These are the three conditions for a good literature review. Then after presenting a theoretical review and the empirical review, the researcher shows the research gap or the knowledge gap. So after presenting the empirical review, where the researcher presents other research studies findings which are related to his study, he presents what he expected to be his particular input to what others has found, and this is what we call research gap. So taking as an example our topic that we have chosen previously, the contribution of a private sector to poverty reduction in developing countries, case study MTN Rwanda, the researcher has to provide in the literature review the theoretical review about generality about the private sector in Rwanda, MTN Rwanda as a private sector company, service offered by MTN Rwanda. He must present dependent variable which is poverty reduction, present indicators of poverty reduction, input of private sector companies to poverty reduction. After this, the researcher must present also the empirical review. The researcher can present, for example, based on our topic, the situation of poverty globally, regionally, and nationally, using statistics from reports and government reports and other organizations report, and he must present also statistics about employment opportunity, living standards. Here in living standards we can have some sub-variables like the situation in using statistical data about access to electricity and other forms of energy, access to clean water and sanitation, urbanization and rural settlement, access to ICT facilities, access to health facilities, access to education, and the empirical review on poverty reduction strategy papers, and the empirical review on private sector and the poverty reduction. All this can be the subtitle in your literature review based on our four chosen topic. So after presenting the literature review, the researcher move on and present the third chapter of his research proposal, which is the research methodology. In research methodology, first of all, the researcher presents his research design. So what is a research design? A research design is a specific plan for identifying the research problem. It constitutes a blueprint for the correction, measurement, and the analysis of data. Note that we have two main research designs. First of all, we have quantitative research design for collecting and analyzing statistical data, and the qualitative research design to analyze qualitative data. After presenting the research design, the researcher presents the area of the study or the profile of the study. This may include the map of the area where the study will be conducted, and they explain why that area is chosen. This is used especially in environmental studies. After presenting the area of the study or the profile of the study, the researcher presents in his methodology what we call population of the study. So what is the population of the study? Population of the study is also called the universe. It is the entire set of people, event, or object which is the object of research and about which the researcher wants to determine some characteristics. After showing his research population, then the researcher move on to what we call sampling design. The sampling process involves taking a proportion of target population, investing this smaller manageable group, and then generalizing the findings to the large population from which the sample was drawn. The sample then is the subset of the population, and the representative sample must have properties that best represent the population so as to allow for an accurate generalization of results. So, in a sampling design, the researcher must show the sample size. Here there are different formulas used to determine the size of the sample. I think I'll make a video highlighting some formulas that can help in determining the size of the sample. The researcher also presents in sampling design the sampling techniques used to sample or to select the members of the sample. For example, we have different techniques of sampling. We have a random sampling. This random sampling is a part of the sampling techniques in which each sample has an equal opportunity, an equal probability of being chosen. There is also non-random sampling, is a sampling technique where the sample selection is based on factors other than just random chance. We have Criterion sampling, which involves the selection of a sample based on some pre-established criteria. We have Purposive sampling, is the sampling technique in which the researcher relies on his or her own judgment when choosing members of population to participate in his study. We have a multistage sampling, which divide the large population into stages to make the sampling more practical. We have also stratified sampling, which is the method of sampling from a population which can be partitioned into subpopulation. There are so many. We have also quota sampling. It requires, normally we are presenting the essentials. It requires to go and read and deepen your understanding on these techniques of sampling. Then after presenting the sampling design, then in his methodology, the researcher also presents the measurement and the scaling. So here, the researcher presents the types of data that he is going to use in his research, whether he is going to use primary data or secondary data. For better understanding, we can ask ourselves, what is primary data? What is secondary data? Primary data, we talk about the primary data when data has been generated by the researcher himself or herself using surveys, interviews, and experiments especially designed by himself to understand and solving the problem at hand. So these are data which are collected by the researcher himself. We call them primary data. Then secondary data are used when the researcher uses data generated by other large governmental institutions or other organizations. Here, the secondary data are not collected by the researcher himself. He can use other people's data, or the researcher can use data collected by other institutions or other researchers. So these are secondary data. So in the methodology of his research, he must highlight or tell or identify the types of data he is going to use in his study, whether primary or secondary data. Then after presenting the measurement and the scaling, the researcher presents what we call data correction techniques. We have numerous data correction techniques. The researcher can use questionnaire technique, where he designed his self-designed and administered questionnaire, where he administered his own questionnaire. He designed and administer his own questionnaire to collect the data. He can use interview technique, where he elaborate interview protocol and start interview the members of his sample. He can use observation technique. He can use documentary technique. Both questionnaire, interview, observation technique, experimental technique, and what we call focus group technique, where the researcher can make an interview of more than 5 or 10 people. That is what we call focus group interview or focus group technique. The researcher can collect the data. Note that for primary data, the researcher can use questionnaire technique, interview, observation, experimental, and focus group technique. Then documentary technique is used when the researcher uses secondary data. In this, he must document himself. This is the reason why it is called documentary technique. So these are data correction techniques: questionnaire, interview, observation, documentary technique, experimental technique, and the focus group interview. So after presenting the types of data correction technique, the researcher presents or highlights the validity and the reliability of data collection tools. When we talk about validity, it's an extent to which an instrument measures what it is supposed to measure. If we has used the questionnaire to collect data, the researcher must show how his questionnaire is valid, the extent by which his questionnaire measures what it is supposed to measure. Therefore, we have here different types of validity. We have a content validity. The content validity is the extent to which the instrument item represents the content that the instrument is designed to measure. Then we have criterion or concurrent validity. The criterion or concurrent validity is one way of to test whether an instrument measures what it is expected to measure, is to compare it to another measure called a criterion measure, which is known to be valid. Here the researcher make a comparison of his data collection tool to other data collection tools which are supposed to be valid. Then we have a face validity. This face validity relies upon the subjective judgment of the researcher. By face validity, the researcher asks himself two questions. Is the instrument measuring what it is supposed to measure? Is the sample being measured adequate to be representative of the behavior or trait being measured? So, by responding to himself to those questions, he can be aware that his data collection tool is valid or not valid. Then we have reliability. About reliability, the reliability refers to accuracy or the consistent of the measurement, that is the extent to which the result remains similar over different forms of the same instrument. Reliability can be also defined as the level of internal consistency or stability of measuring device over time. After presenting the validity and the reliability of his data collection tools, the researcher presents how data processing and the data analysis. He highlights how he's going to process data and to analyze data. In data processing, the researcher make editing and coding, classification and tabulation. He tries to process data by editing, coding, classification and tabulation. Then in data analysis, the researcher can use descriptive statistic analysis like frequencies, proportions, mode, median, mean, interquartile, range, and the standard deviation to analyze the presented data. Then the researcher also must present some ethical consideration in his research methodology. Here, higher academic institutions requires the researcher to have a letter of introduction or the permission from the dean or the head of department, acceptable letter from the authorities of the institution where he collects the data, this acceptance letter from the authorities to gather data, and the consent letter of the participant in his research. All these are required to the researcher to be presented before the submission of his final citation. Yeah, we have finally what we call limitation of the study. Here the student researcher is required to write any obstacles that he expects to encounter in his research. After research methodology, then the researcher must design the questionnaire and start collecting data. After collecting data, then he proceeds to what we call data presentation, analysis, and interpretation and discussion. Here in this chapter, the researcher proceeds to what we call systematic presentation of data. Here the researcher presents data in forms of table. He can use charts and figures. Qualitative data here must be presented in forms of themes and categories. So then after presenting data, the researcher proceeds to the analysis and the interpretation of data. This is where data presented are explained. The researcher presents and analyzes the respondent profile, the perception of the respondent on independent variable, the perception of respondents on dependent variables, the relationship between independent variables and dependent variables, and he can use even ratio analysis to support his results obtained from SPSS. When he used SPSS, for example, is the software which is used to analyze data. Yeah, he can use it and shows ratio analysis to support his results. Then in this chapter also, he presents what we call discussion. This is the last section of data presentation, analysis, and interpretation. Here, the student is required to show the implication of the results all and the comparison with a similar empirical study to strengthen the findings. Then after data presentation, analysis, interpretation, and discussion, the researcher presents the chapter 5 of his dissertation, which is the conclusion and the suggestions. By the conclusion, the researcher presents the research objectives and the summary of the major findings. Then suggestions should be according to the weak or strong findings of the study, and they are addressed to different individuals related to the study. And after this, the researcher presents the reference where he shows all the documents, books, reports, and even web links used, he consulted in order to elaborate the citation. He must use some higher education institution requires the researcher to use APA style in presenting references, where I present author, the year, the title of the article, city, and the publishing house, including the web link. Then after presenting this comes appendices of his dissertation, where he put in appendices the questionnaire or the protocol of interview, the introduction letters from Dean of Faculty, the Dean of Departments, authorization to correct the data from different authorities, and the consents of participants. All these are represented in the appendices of his dissertation.